Yes, sir, Mr. Chair. Jim McLean. Keith Bailey. Paul Moscotti. Sandra York. Yeah, Sandra York. Jeremy Inman. Carolyn Lomas. Cindy Nord. Yes, sir, it has.
My pleasure.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mr. Chairman, just a reminder for the board, if they can use the microphones, it'll help us with the recording of the minutes and for those who may be watching. Thank you.
Could I get a motion to approve?
So moved.
Any questions? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Kirk, could you tell us the action item tonight?
Yes, sir. I'll let Dan take it.
Yeah. You need to go. You can go. We're going to excuse Kirk. He's not feeling very well tonight. So we're going to let him move, and I'll take over the meeting from the staff side. First action item, Mr. Chairman, is action item A, and that is election of officers.
Do we have any nominations for chairman?
I got a nomination.
Please share it.
I nominate, drum roll, Mr. Paul Moscotti to continue to be the chair of the BAR.
Any others? Make a motion. Make a motion for myself, Paul Moscotti, to fulfill the role of chair.
So moved.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Vice chairman. Any nominations for vice chairman? I think that'd be an excellent choice. Make a motion for Keith Bailey to be vice chair. Can I have a second, please?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
The last time we did this, Daniel, I thought there was a secretary, but Kirk is going to be. Seems like we took a vote on secretary.
The ordinance,
Yes.
yeah, the ordinance allows you to vote for the secretary, and it allows the staff to be an option. So,
So we could just appoint
yes,
Kirk Wilson as secretary.
correct.
Can I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor of Kirk Wilson's fulfilling the role of secretary, say aye.
Aye.
I think that's everybody.
I think that is.
You want to talk about the second item, the discussion item, Daniel?
Yes, so action item number 2, or item B, would be the discussion and recommendation of the 2025 Land Development Ordinance update to the Town of Blythewood Planning Commission. And the key sections for this particular board are specifically like Chapter 3, and I've noted a couple other subsections there. However, I have Brian Mabry with us tonight via Teams. He's on PowerPoint behind us here, and he's going to be walking us through presentation of what our new land development ordinance is and how it's used, and we'll highlight some of the changes we've made, and we'll do some Q&A along the way as we need. But if I can, I will introduce Brian Mabry. He's with Kendon Keith's Collaborative, and you'll have to turn your chairs to face the screen there, and he will drive us along this PowerPoint, and we're both here for questions. And at the end, Mr. Chairman, we'll probably see if there's any questions from the board before we ask for a recommendation. So, Brian, I'll turn it over to you, let you get rolling here, and we'll go from there. Just as a note of clarification, our Board of Zoning Appeals meeting follows this one at 6:30. So I'll turn it over to you, sir, and I appreciate it.
Thanks, Daniel. I will proceed on talking, and if my audio has problems, I'll rely on Daniel to kind of stop me and or text me. I know you got my number if I need to stop. I've got my phone right by me. Thanks, everyone, for allowing me to present on the LDO, Land Development Ordinance. We're getting close to adoption, as you'll see as we go through this. First is how this LDO is organized. It's sort of, as you see on the left there, organized so that kind of casual users or people who are just kind of wanting to know the basics can get information about their property at the front of the document, what it's zoned, what kind of land uses are allowed, what kind of setbacks and building heights are in play for that district. But then more toward the middle and back is more for sort of technical users or power users, people who are landscape architects or engineers, surveyors. That's where the more technical standards are, or attorneys even for the procedures, what kind of steps are in the process, who do I need to receive approval from, those kind of things are more in the middle and the back of the document if you were to print it out. It's really an online document though, and meant to be kind of better used in its online version as opposed to being printed out, but it can still be printed out or made into a PDF if that's what someone wants to do with it. And there's a lot to cover, and I'm just trying to hit the high points in this PowerPoint. Of course, if there's something you need me to go back to when I'm done, I'd be happy to do that. We're, again, hitting the finish line rather soon here with the public hearings that are going to take place with the Planning Commission and the Town Council, and will culminate in adoption next month. The town has a comprehensive plan, and this land development ordinance is one way to implement the policies of the comprehensive plan. Think of the comp plan as a menu at a restaurant, while the LDO is the recipe book or the cookbook at a restaurant. The comprehensive plan lays out the vision for how the town wants to grow in the future in various ways, just like kind of a menu at a restaurant lays out what you could have there when you're going to go eat there, but it doesn't give the directions on how to cook the food, and the LDO gives the directions on how to cook the food. It's a legal document, but we also try to make it user-friendly and understandable at the same time while remaining legally defensible. So some other information about what a land development ordinance is. It consolidates the town's development-related regulations into a single document. This has a lot of benefits as far as helping with removing duplications and inconsistencies. Being a single source like that, it's one stop for the public or staff or applicants to go to when they need to see how, what kind of process they go through for a variance, or what kind of standards apply in the architectural overlay district, those type of things. It simplifies all around kind of just interpretation and administration and enforcement, and helps to promote user friendliness as well. Some things that LDO is not, I have those on the screen here. It doesn't set a property tax policy or assess property values within the town. It doesn't lay out annexation plans for properties that could become part of the town. It's not a capital improvements program, which is a schedule and a budget for extending and widening and improving infrastructure in a city or town. It's not a building code, so it doesn't regulate how many bathrooms a building has to have or what kind of electrical service it has. It does have to do with the exterior of buildings, but not the interior and the structural soundness of a building, like a building code would. It's not construction standards. That's more within the realm of like the town engineer or public works, where they have a document about manhole spacing and curb and gutter design and things that are very specific like that. Then finally, another thing that it's not is property maintenance or nuisance code. You all may have something similar to this in the town code that forces landowners to keep their property in shape and free of nuisances and things like that, but the LDO isn't really set up for that either. It's about land uses on private property and how sites are designed and subdivided and things of that nature. Just to provide a few images to go along with that, here's several things that a land development ordinance can control. How land is used, whether
Brian,
it's
real
kind
quick.
of a mix of land uses.
Brian, real quick, we got a question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, hold on.
Hey, Brian, can you go, Keith Bailey here, can you go to the previous slide, please?
And I'm sorry, I was having a hard time hearing
previous-
that question. If someone could repeat it.
Previous slide, please, Brian.
Okay.
And I was just looking at the annexation policy. First of all, it says what LDO is not. So it's not an annexation policy, that's what we're saying. But it does regulate the areas that have been annexed by the town. What does regulate mean?
Yes. So if I understood the question, where an LDO comes into play with annexation is it sets usually the zoning district for what newly annexed property would end up being, usually the kind of the lowest intensity district So that's sort of how it relates to annexation.
Right. So in other words, it regulates the areas that are in the town proper, but it does not dictate what we do or do not annex.
What
Exactly.
does regulate mean in terms of this particular statement here?
Well, regulates means all the regulations that are within the zoning ordinance. So whether you got regulations related to what you can or
So you're
can't
talking about
build.
the written document, not the job of what the planning commission is supposed to do.
Right, talking about the ordinance itself, regulates, right.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Okay, Brian, I think we're good.
Okay. So how land is used, whether it's a mix of land uses or single-family residential only in various zoning districts, how much space is set aside for parks and open space, whether a lot or none, the density of development as far as residential development. You could have anything from apartments. In this sample, those happen to be, and that's not in Blythewood or even in South Carolina. These are just kind of general images. Higher density for apartments where those are allowed versus lower density for single family where those are allowed. Building heights, building location on a property, setbacks, things of that nature, as well as parking and how parking is regulated and controlled, how buildings on their exterior are designed, how much landscaping is required and where it's required. All of those things can be regulated and controlled by a land development ordinance. So here's a high-level table of contents, 10 chapters plus appendices in the land development ordinance. I'm going to hit the very high points of many of these here. In the first chapter, it just sets out the purpose statements for the land development ordinance. It addresses how conflicts are dealt with, like if there's a conflict within the land development ordinance text, which we don't want there to be, but in case there is, or in the future, if one arises through future amendments, then how those are addressed. And again, as was asked earlier, the jurisdiction is laid out in the LDO, which is the town of Blythewood, not the county area, but the town itself.
I have a question.
It's going to go through the zoning districts.
Brian, just a minute. We got another
Yes.
question.
Actually, it's back on the last one. When you say 4 units to an acre, how close does that mean the houses are?
And Daniel, can you repeat the question for me, please?
Back up one slide. I think it's a density question. The specific question was 4 units per acre. How close would the houses be?
Okay, so, and this is just a sample from another place. It's not what's necessarily in the code. 4 units per acre means kind of the lot size of the residence. A typical setback on the sides for houses is 5 feet on each side of the property line. So a typical side setback, again, is 5 feet or so, 7.5 feet sometimes. But that general area.
I'm sorry, I can't understand what he's saying.
Well, I can explain.
But it sounds so close together.
I understand, but the importance on this is he's given examples of what the land development ordinance does. It may not be specific to what all of Blythewood has in it in terms of this LDO. So, like for this example, 4 units per acre, that'd be quarter-acre lots, right?
Yep.
So, but that may not be every zoning district we have, because we have a array of zoning districts within this LDO. So these are just examples to go by on what this ordinance actually regulates, not so much what we have.
I understand that, but I think it's important we understand how close they are going to put those houses, 4 units to an acre. If that's what it looks like, that's awful.
Sure, but we would have to get into that subsection of that ordinance, which is the same as we have now. We actually didn't change the density within any of our zone districts.
So is there any chance of changing that? I mean, it's just awful.
Well, I mean, there is, but it hasn't been brought up.
Well, I'm bringing it up.
I understand.
I mean, I think we know a lot now more about people and living, and that putting that many people that close together is not a good idea.
And, and as Daniel said, this is just images from a completely different
could have
place and state even.
Well, I'm not sure we won't allow it and see what goes up. No, we don't. Okay, just a concern.
I think we can continue, Brian.
Yeah, exactly.
So Chapter 2 establishes various residential and non-residential zoning districts. These are based on what you had already, but kind of retooled and renamed. The table here shows the new name on the left, how it relates to the future land use category in your comprehensive plan, various development types that are allowed within that district, which I'll get into on the next slide, and the former zoning districts that make up each of these new or reconfigured districts. There's the RU or rural district, residential, which is SR, and semi-urban residential, which is SU. And I said that there's different kinds of development types within them, and this is a sample of the various forms. There's conventional, cluster, and planned, and each one has a different amount of open space that's required and a different amount of density that's allowed related to that amount of open space. So for example, the suburban residential district has the conventional, cluster, and planned development types allowed within it. And this sort of relates back to what was being asked about a moment ago. It shows the different lot sizes, whether it's the 20,000 square foot lots, 12,000 square foot, or 8,000. Each of those within that zoning district has an associated amount of open space that needs to be provided or preserved as part of the development. Conventional there doesn't have any open space requirement. Cluster has 20% and planned has 30%. And basically, the more open space that's dedicated by a development, the slightly more units per acre they get out of it. So conventional has 2 units per acre in this particular zoning district. Cluster allows for 2.5 units per acre, and planned option allows for 3 units per acre. And those all, again, have increasing amounts of open space to offset that density that goes along with those various options within the suburban residential district. There was the questions about side setbacks. In this instance, those setbacks are 15 feet, 12 feet, and 10 feet, which are kind of bigger than the typical 5 and 7.5 foot that I mentioned a moment ago for the question. There's also non-residential and mixed-use districts, suburban commercial, auto-urban commercial, town center, mixed-use, and hospitality. And then there are business and industrial districts, heavy industrial, light industrial, office park, and business campus. Then there are a couple of special purpose and overlay districts. The architectural overlay district, which I believe there's some notes later on about you all having worked with staff or representatives of your board having worked with staff to put in the changes to the architectural overlay district, and then of course retaining the planned development district, which is pretty common for most LDOs. The LDO has a use table that shows all the different zoning districts in columns and all the different land uses in rows, and shows where those particular land uses are allowed in which zoning district. In this example, it happens to be financial institution. Wherever you see the dashes, that means that particular land use isn't allowed in that particular zoning district, which again makes up the columns. But it is allowed where you see Ps. That means permitted. Certain other land uses are C for conditional uses. That means they require, they're conditional use, and some of them are S's, which means they're special exceptions, which means the Zoning Board of Adjustment makes final decision on whether they can be allowed or not after a public hearing. This is a very common way of setting up land development ordinances and having a table like this. This is just kind of further elaborating, showing, going across the different districts that make up the columns there, whether there's a C or a P or dashes that come into play as to whether that land use is permitted in that district or not. There are use categories in this LDO, which are ways of grouping land uses together and regulating them so that they're all kind of these related land uses are all treated similarly in the use table. It also shows different accessory uses that are allowed in this particular instance in the office use category. There's also rules for accessory uses and temporary uses. So accessory uses are things like sheds, short-term rentals, home occupations, pools, other things like that, accessory dwelling units. There's rules set out for those. There's also rules for temporary uses like contractor's office at a construction site or fireworks stand, food truck, things of that nature. There's different allowances in different zoning districts for each of those temporary uses and amounts of time that they can be in any one location since they are temporary uses. Moving on to Chapter 3, there's several parts to this, but the highlights are smaller changes on a site require compliance with fewer of these sections that you see on the screen, while bigger changes, bigger additions, completely new developments have to comply with all of the provisions that you see on the screen. The first being site design. So there's one particular tool in this section that is a sustainability index. That means that if a site works in certain environmentally friendly characteristics like solar panels or skylights or green roofs, which are having vegetation on the roof, then they can trade in those features for either density bonuses, so slightly more dense development, slightly higher height bonuses, more lot coverage, reductions in parking, or more sign area than they would have gotten normally. And that's for working in, again, environmentally friendly, sustainable characteristics like you see listed out under the examples there on the left column. There's also parking, loading, and stacking regulations that relate to just what it sounds like. There's also maximum parking requirements so that nowadays with online ordering and grocery deliveries and things like that, sites don't need as much parking as they used to. And so there's a maximum cap on parking in many instances to avoid kind of the masses of unused parking that contributes to drainage issues at times or heat island effects and things of that nature. There's also special rules for RVs, campers, and commercial vehicles. We have loading regulations and requirements that the loading areas be screened, especially when they are visible to or adjacent to residential areas. There are stacking requirements in the LDO, which is lining up, cars at a fast food or Starbucks restaurant. The requirements for having certain amounts of space for cars to line up so that they don't bleed out into the street. And driveway spacing and driveway width standards as well are part of this section. The next section has to do with trees, landscaping, and buffering. Was there a question? Oh, okay, sorry, I misheard. Each district has a certain percentage of the site that has to be landscaped. There's also heritage tree preservation requirements that require that certain exemplary specimens of trees be preserved on a site. There's requirements for parking lot landscaping, again, that help to reduce the heat island effect that can come with a massive paved area. There are buffer requirements that have to be in place between, for example, industrial or heavy commercial zoning districts and residential so that those residential uses are protected from the potential negative effects that could come from heavier manufacturing being close to residential. And then there's the ability to for alternative compliance, and that means that certain designs that meet the spirit of the rules of the section can be approved administratively if they can demonstrate that they're kind of going above and beyond in other areas of the landscaping design. So it's a way to sort of streamline approval while making sure that the design that is being approved is of high quality. There are sign standards as well that are part of this chapter that standards for permanent signs, temporary signs. There's prohibitions on certain sign types and materials. And a big thing is that they're content neutral. There was a Supreme Court decision about 10 years ago that says that you can't regulate signs, cities can't and towns can't regulate signs on what they say or what their purpose is. Instead, it has to be based on the structural characteristics of a sign. So you can't have like real estate sign. Instead, that has to be something like H-frame sign. You can't have apartment sign or agricultural sign or various things like that. They have to be based on the structure of the sign, any regulations, and not on what the sign says. There are outdoor lighting provisions, the bottom line of which is that there has to, light can't bleed up into the sky or onto other people's property or onto the street. And there are public art requirements where certain larger non-residential developments have to either provide on-site permanent art fixtures or pay into a fee in lieu where they would be held into an account that could then go and be used by the city to provide public art. The administrator, which is Daniel, can provide and refer designs if necessary to town council to get their input as well on what's proposed. For the subdivision standards, it's a long chapter, but really just to say that that's the rules about street connectivity, easements, sidewalk widths, how property is subdivided. All of those things come into play on subdivision standards. How utilities are extended, and those kind of things are all addressed in Chapter 4. Chapter 5 is environmental management, and the main part of it is the floodplain regulations, and those have just been carried over from the existing floodplain standards. Chapter 6 is administration. That is for showing and establishing the various review bodies and decision-making bodies, the Town Council, the Planning Commission, Board of Zoning Appeals, Board of Architectural Review, Board of Historic Preservation. Those various entities are set up or either referenced in the town code, like the Town Council is set up in the town code and they're just referenced in this document. And it establishes what we call administrative bodies. So the Technical Review Committee, the group that looks at submittals and makes sure that they comply with all the various rules of the town. Planning director, building official, town engineer, floodplain administrator, those are all established or reestablished as the case may be in the LDO. The Chapter 7 is development review provisions. This mainly has a table in it that shows all the different review procedures, whether it's text amendment or rezoning or creation of a historic preservation district. All of these different processes and procedures are laid out and given into a table where the submittal timing of that particular application is spelled out. Like if it were a sign permit, the submittal timing is, it has to be approved before you can construct or substantially modify a sign. The expiration column in that table sets out a time frame for when that approval expires. If, again, for example, for a sign permit, if the sign is never built, then eventually that approval of the sign permit expires after usually about 6 months. It shows who makes recommendation and who makes final action on the various applications that are in the LDO. So again, with the sign permit, that would be the planning director. And then whether public notice is required, and if so, what kind. Whether it's published public notice, posted on a sign, public notice, or mailed public notice. All of those are listed in the table. And then further into the chapter, it's spelled out, you know, the timing of the notice, the contents of the notice, who, if it's a mailed notice, who it has to go to as far as, you know, like a radius from the property. All those things are dealt with. Chapter 8 is nonconformities or grandfathering. This is for either land uses or buildings that were established before, either before zoning was adopted in the town, or that were in one way or another legally established according to the rules of their time when they were established, but now no longer are allowed. And so it just says that those kinds of land uses or structures can continue to exist. They don't have to be demolished or anything like that. Continue to be in business, continue to be lived in, but there are parameters and restrictions placed on those properties that they can't expand, you know, as a non-conforming use. And then there's also provision that if a non-conforming use ceases activity, ceases to be in business, for example, for 6 months, then it's considered abandoned, and that non-conforming or that grandfathered use can't establish itself again. Second to the last chapter is chapter 9, enforcement and remedies. This is a highly kind of legal chapter, so I'll just say that it shows, it gives a process for what violations are considered, different kinds of remedies that the town can pursue in order to get compliance on a property that's violating the LDO, and so forth and so on. The final chapter is chapter 10, which is mainly the definitions. It shows what we mean by shall versus may. It delegates responsibility. So when we say the director shall approve or shall disapprove, we really mean the director and the planning staff as well. So all of the technical terms that are in the LDO are defined in this chapter. So the following 2 slides are just a culmination of summary of changes that are in the LDO compared to the previous document, the previous LDO. So there's fewer zoning districts, which is, in our view, a good thing. It makes the administration easier on staff. It makes it more understandable to the general public, cuts down on duplication and redundancy, going from 21 districts to 12. There's less planning jargon and less legalese in this one than you would see in an older style or in your previous land development ordinance. There's the promotion of arts and culture through the public art requirement. There's more graphics and illustrations and tables, so it's more user-friendly. It'll be hosted on Encode Plus, which is our proprietary code hosting software that makes it a code and its graphics much more attractive and understandable than other, what we think of as sort of competitors like Municode. Continuing on, there's several different improvements and standards related to landscaping, lot density, building and site design, as you're aware, with the architectural overlay district. And there will be also a new zoning map that shows the various zoning districts on the map with very little change other than some particular properties in the town center and hospitality areas that would be changing over potentially. The final slide is highlights that have taken place throughout the project starting in February 2023, so almost 5 years or 2 years ago. Several different meetings going through the process, culminating again in adoption in January of this year. This document has to go to the Planning Commission for a public hearing, where they will then make a formal recommendation to the town council, who holds their hearings and has final authority on what's in it. And so the final next steps in this process, those just give some dates to some of those key future events that I was talking about. So that wraps up a very quick overview of this document, and if there are any other further questions, I'd be happy to try to answer.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate you running us through that.
You're welcome.
Do we have any weight in this?
Mr. Chairman, do you have it? Is there any questions from you or the members of the board?
Yeah, there is a couple questions. What exactly are you asking for tonight? What action do we need to take tonight?
So I guess just to be, completely transparent, ordinarily, the BAR doesn't have a formal recommendation process, much like the BZA as it relates to a land development ordinance, and that's not unique to Blythewood. That would be any city or municipality in the state. But in this context, we've kept the BZA, BAR, and Planning Commission in lockstep with this process, holding the joint meetings, sending out the email information, the comment opportunities, and so on and so forth. So from my perspective, I'm just moving forward with a consensus approach where each board is given the opportunity to review, final presentation. As you're aware, at the beginning of this year, at the end of last year, we sent out what we referred to as the final drafts of this document for review. There was a 30-day comment period and those things. So we're pretty much at the final and conclusion. And Mr. Chairman, I'm sure you recall yourself, myself, Carol, and Ralph spending numerous weeks going through the BAR's respective areas of Chapter 3 for site and design. So at this juncture, we're just looking to have a recommendation or a consensus from the BAR, and we're just going to just move that recommendation as a noting point for the process, and then same thing with the BZA, and then when we're at the Planning Commission level, their recommendation will be the formal recommendation of Town Council. So, and at that point, we'll have the hearing.
If I'm not mistaken, the purpose of this whole exercise was to simplify the ordinance that we had on the books at the time. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, repeat that question. I got distracted.
The purpose of this whole exercise was to simplify what we already had as a land development ordinance. Is that?
For the most part, simplify it, modernize it a little bit better, and make sure that we were at the most optimal standards for the town of Blythewood. So we didn't go lesser than the ordinance. We either went equal to or better than in terms of either whether it be graphics, illustrations, more inclusive, like adding the arts component so that we can address that with development potentials, just extra little details to the ordinance. So
it would sound like what we're being asked to recommend is, or to attest to, is that it's not whether the document is right, it's whether the document is accurate in one sense. In other words, I don't know that we could go through that document if we had time and mark it up and say, no, that's not supposed to be like that, it's supposed to be like this. As opposed to what it sounds like they did was took a body of work and tried to simplify it and reorganize it. Does that make sense?
yeah, that's pretty much the grasp of it. So yeah, we're not asking for the BAR to determine whether something is right or wrong. A lot of this is in some arguments interpretive, but also we've had a company working on this for 2 years. We've had staff working on this for 2 years. So there's been a lot of, expert, work toward this document. And then also, I think ultimately the BAR would attest to the work that you, me, Ralph, Carol, and all of us address specifically for the BAR is of satisfaction for this board. So, because those are the items we spent the time on, right?
That's right.
Right.
And I'm comfortable with that. It's the rest of the document that I just want to make sure I got a firm grip on what we're being asked.
Right, and that's the intent of this process, is that the BAR is comfortable with their portion of the ordinance, the BZA is comfortable with their portion of the ordinance, and ultimately the Planning Commission is obviously the ultimate say for the whole ordinance, and that they're comfortable. So, and that's why, in effect, they've had more workshops and those things, because more of the ordinance applies to that area of the planning side of things. But yeah, for this one, the chapter 3 has been referenced numerous times for those reasons, because that's that's the section that this board operates off of the most.
Correct.
Right.
That's the portion that we went through all those weeks.
Yes, about 10 weeks total, every Friday, section for section.
Not the total board, right? Just you all?
Ralph, myself,
Yeah.
Daniel, and I think to have done it with the full board would have taken a bit of.
Right, I'm not
Real
saying it
time.
needed it, I'm just,
But Ralph and I,
yeah.
Daniel, Kirk,
Carol.
whoever else was there. I
Yeah,
can't remember
Carol,
who else
Kirk.
was there.
Yeah, Carol was there in the early parts, but we wrapped it up.
It was a very in-depth
I'm sure.
investigation.
I'm just still not real clear exactly what we're being asked to do. I hear it. And some of what you're proposing is just terrible for Blythewood. And it just personifies that they want to ram down on us that came here to be rural, these incredible developments that are just side by side. And you said, well, nobody raised that. Well, somebody should raise that.
Well, to be clear, so the ordinance that we have now we're moving through has no greater densities than the ordinance you've been operating by for 15 years.
But that doesn't say anything to me. It doesn't
Well-
answer my questions that
Well,
I
look-
see what almost came next door to me
Sure.
is one of those horrible, twice we've had that. And no one wants to go to bat and say, hey, wait a minute, what do we really want Blythewood to be here? Why are we all here?
Right.
think the
If
master
I'm
plan-
able to finish, we actually removed the highest density ordinance or land use, which was the R5 in this process. And then we got creative with the other densities, which were where Brian was talking about. It would have to be offered through incentives, so the developer would have to give us something in exchange to get higher density. So we did do several things to combat some of the density, but we can only do so much when,
Okay, and
You know.
everybody can keep saying that. We can only do so much. We have Scout out there now that is at the end of my road that is going to raise havoc with my life. It already has raised havoc. Their infrastructure cannot handle that. So I have no faith in all of this at all. And I realize that you're right, that what they're asking us to do is something very different. But I just think it's just horrible to see this. It just makes me boil.
thank you.
Nobody cares what this wonderful place can be.
I'm not going to back and forth with it. I know that this has been a 2-year process, and there's been a lot of opportunities for public comment, and we've gotten all
And
those.
we have tried to learn, but it was already done before we could do anything.
Okay, I'll end by saying that this isn't the public hearing, and that will be at the council level, so those matters can be brought up by all citizens, and I encourage those to be brought up as we move through the process to see if there's a consensus for change. But tonight, for this matter, for this Board of Architectural Review, we're specifically looking at the architectural and design components, which would be related to what this board approves. That's the recommendation staff's asking for.
Even that, we should have had something that could have opened to look at that. I can't digest all of this. A day, at the end of my day, I can't digest all of this. I don't even know what I'm saying yes or no to.
Man, we've sent,
Could not open that document.
we sent this stuff out last year. This has been sent out in draft form in numerous links and numerous formats.
For being prepared tonight for this meeting, okay? I called, I said I cannot open it, okay? So I'm not prepared because I could not see it. And it's not clear to me when I get here what it is you want from me. That's not right. You have to prepare us.
Al, I'm sorry you felt unprepared, but we have been sending this information out for many, many months.
Talking tonight.
I understand what you're saying.
You did not send me a document that I could open up to prepare myself for tonight.
When you called this morning, I asked if you'd like me to send it. You asked me what was going to be on the agenda.
I didn't know
I explained the two items.
I can hardly understand that whole
Okay.
presentation.
Thank you, ma'am.
The part of the document that specifically applies to this board, I've got a high level of confidence we got it right. We were very conservative when we went through it. There was a lot of changes that we made that not only simplified things, but somewhat tightened up a lot of things. It doesn't address what you're talking about, the part that we went through.
And we're not here to address that other, but it does wreck your faith. When you see, I mean, you're living here, and next to you is gonna come one of these developments. And I see that we're saying we can have 4 to 1 acre, it's just horrific. And I know it's not, we don't
No, I
have,
understand.
we don't have power, I get that. But who's gonna care about what Blythewood is about? And I'm willing to come here, and I think you've done a great job. I think we're probably, for the BAR, it's probably very good. And if you say that, I believe you, and I can go along with that. But I don't like the way some of the meetings are ended. I don't like that I didn't have the information.
Hey,
Tell
Dan.
me that I could have gotten it a year ago.
Mr. Steins.
Yes, sir.
I mean, I commend this happening, this presentation. I think we would be better off to focus on those particular areas that directly relate to the BAR. And that was, what, chapter 3
It is.
that he presented?
If you were to go back and look at the document, if you can open the document and look at it, if you go to chapter 3, what you can't see is what was there, obviously, probably unless you get an old document.
Mhm.
What is there is the final product of what we talked about. Just for what we talked about is chapter 3, and what we went to in detail. And that was a lot of meetings with Ralph, and we had a lot of details in it. We did not talk about, to my knowledge, we didn't get into densities and that sort of thing. Charge.
What are some of the main points that you think we did, which BAR can be proud of?
It talked about building facades, building heights, building widths, materials, a lot of materials, windows, just how buildings are, what the setback would be. A lot of the details that we would be interested in, but to be honest with you.
It is our purview, and that's all we have. But I think someone's gotta stop this other business of, nobody cares about Blythewood.
Daniel, if I understood you correctly, and I didn't know this until you said it, you took the most, it sounds like, we took the most dense requirement and pulled that off, what was in our old document. You pulled the highest density there was and pulled that out, and that's not in the new document.
That's correct. R5 was your density requirement in the previous or the current ordinance. And in my records, there have been attempts for rezones to that and have failed historically. So we viewed that as a non-consensus to maintain that density, so we removed it. So now that left your R8, which is more of your Ashley Oaks type subdivisions, where you're in the 3rd acre and larger lot sizes, seems to be the average consensus. And also, to be clear, when you're writing a land development code, you don't want to hamstring yourself so tightly that you have no option. Just because there's an option for a possible denser zoning district, it doesn't mean that the planning commission or whoever will approve it. And I think we have seen that time and time again here in Blythewood, where some of those much greater density developments have not been approved. But I digress on that. But to answer your question, yes, R5 was removed from the zoning code in the new zoning code.
And Mr. Steins, was the master plan, was that taken into consideration in development of this document they're talking about?
Comprehensive plan, yes, sir, it was.
No, that master plan for the town. not the
We did review the town, you're talking about, I forget what year that document was done, but we,
2012.
yeah. we did take that document into account. That's where a lot of the sustainability stuff
Correct.
derive from. That's where those incentive things derive from. And so, yes, sir.
So what we're being asked to recommend tonight is to at least approve and move forward with chapter 3 specifically.
Yes, sir. It'd be the areas that, apply to this board. The motion can be made how you wish. Yes, ma'am.
Well, that's really the only chapter that applies to our jurisdiction.
Right.
Any other questions? You got any questions? Well, can I have a motion to approve
Chapter 3.
the rewriting of chapter 3? And I don't know the title of that chapter exactly. We're going to say use
It's
chapter.
site and design standards.
Brian, can you bring it up?
It's just a recommendation. Brian, do you want to go to slide deck for chapter 3, site and design standards?
So in the new LDO, this is part of chapter 2, actually, and it's the architectural overlay district is what it's called, 2.03.01.
Right, but the BAR also does a lot of review under chapter 3
Oh, okay.
for for site architectural standards and everything. So it would actually be the AO district, Mr. Chairman, and also the chapter 3 site building and site design standards.
So building and site, chapter 3, building and site design is what we're going to
Yes, sir.
recommend to the board. Can I have a second?
So moved.
Any other questions? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Is that all you need?
Yes, sir.
I don't think there's any open citizens comments. Does anybody have anything else? Make a motion to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
Thank you all. Brian, we'll do a quick turnaround here and then get geared up for BZA.